This is Matt. We are both ecologists at the Wildlife Trust, and together with our colleague and marine ecologist Mel Broadhurst-Allen, so I'm sure a lot of you know her already, we form the Alderney State of Nature team. But today, Matt and I will be giving a talk on 20 years of data collection to inform action for Alderney's key species and habitats. So, the Alderney State of Nature, what is it? It is a 3-year project funded by the Social Investment Fund Guernsey. We are currently 1 year into the project, and its main aim is to better understand how Alderney's key habitats and species are changing, whether that be positively or negatively, to use this information to inform work that we do on our nature reserves and the work that we contribute to the Ramsar site, and to also make this information available, so for the public, for stakeholders, for government, for decision making, so for example, states of Alderney doing their strategy for nature and agriculture, and to also engage the community with these changes and encourage biological recording. The project looks to examples from the UK, so I'm sure everyone's aware of the UK state of nature and how they're being done on, or have been done on regional scales. So for example, the Somerset and Cornwall state of nature assessments. We want to look to these examples, but cater them to Alderney's unique environment and wildlife. So that's Alderney. So the project has 4 objectives. So the first objective is to identify key species and habitats globally, locally, and for the community. So when we were coming up with the objectives, we had the idea to do a key species or habitat list, but we also considered whether we wanted to do more of a kind of composite group of indicator species approach. We went for key species and habitat lists in the end, just because a lot of conservation action and intervention does need to be tailored to specific life histories of different species. And so we went with that approach for us. But of course, that isn't always necessarily the better approach. It's just the one we went with. Our second objective is to identify how these are changing and when change requires a conservation response. So setting a favourable status for these species and habitats and establishing what our limits of acceptable change would look like. We also are aiming to make data as open as possible so anyone can understand changes to the environment. So, for example, through the Alderney Record Centre, making data available, but as I said before, publishing our results from the state of nature so that anybody can read it. And to also engage the community with biological recording, citizen scientists, to hopefully build a sense of ownership of Alderney's environment and further engage the community. For today's talk, Matt and I will be focusing on the first objective, so identifying key species and habitats. Just because of time constraints, we'll be focusing on our kind of results for the key species list, but the habitats list will come later, maybe in autumn reporting. Yeah. So when we were thinking about developing a list of key habitats and species, we were trying to figure out a framework or a criteria that meant we could encompass kind of all key. And we came up with 4 criteria. So the first is to include species and habitats of conservation concern. So that's locally in Alderney, but also regionally, so in the Channel Islands, the UK, and nationally as well. We also wanted to look at species that were endemic to Alderney, or if Alderney contained a substantial portion of the population. Our second criteria was to include or to look at species that were of economic value, so maybe directly through fisheries, but also indirectly through ecosystem services, and to look at species that had cultural value too. So what contributes to well-being of people of Alderney? We wanted to look at harmful species, so of course invasive non-native, or any non-natives with a risk of becoming invasive, or a known invasive non-native outside of Alderney, and also those that had any legal requirements. So we came up with our narrative criteria and these different categories, and then we started to review information sources. So what kind of information provided lists of vulnerable, valuable species, things like that. So we sifted through international, national, regional, and local lists and designations, 501 in total, which is a lot. I'm sure multiple people in the room, I emailed probably you at some point asking for any sort of regional list for the Channel Islands, and those have all fed into this. We also went out to the community, so carried out stakeholder and community engagement. So through a deliberately very open questionnaire, we asked people what animals and plants were important to them. And from this, we got 412 different species or species groups. And so once we gathered these information sources, we then needed to weight them, which is what Matt will now talk about, as well as our results.
So I get the fun bit, really, which is actually what we found. So we've got a problem right there. So we've gone kind of, you could go, I was chatting to Lee before about sort of local red listing and going down that approach. We've gone with the kind of taking all of this composite information from loads of different places. And that is brilliant because you're kind of asking. So a process to weight those and take into account the most important information. So we weighted them according to relevance to the narrative criteria. So kind of how key a piece of information would be for a decision-making process. So if you're looking at that conservation concern one, if something is at risk of global extinction and permanent loss, that's kind of more important than, for instance, like if you're talking about kind of national rarity or something like that. But national rarity has its place. It's just not gonna feed into what we're doing quite as much. So looking at that kind of uniqueness and value, also spatial proximity to Alderney. So if things are around the channel, we've kind of upweighted them a bit more than if they're sort of the other side of Europe. More recent data we've upweighted a bit as well. And then we've also scored things for how objective they are, because we talked to lots of you, and lots of you had brilliant, fantastic methodologies for data. We also had quite a lot of more opinion-based things, and so we've kind of tried to take that into account in what we're doing. And then you might be thinking, well, that's great, but sort of a near threatened species in Europe versus a kind of GB red list species. Well, if you're saying GB red list might be more, well, there's this kind of within source bit as well. So you balance that out too. So you've got all of those different bits of information. So that's global, national, red lists, rarity lists, also international conventions. Some taxon groups have way more of these. People love listing whales on things, and bats as well. So we kind of took that into account with a bit of a central tendency and a bias up towards the top end as well, to give a sort of balanced perspective of the amount of information and not over penalise species we don't have loads for, but also take into account that if something is listed in every convention going, there's probably a reason for that. And then for the moment, what we've done is we've done a kind of broad box around Alderney and everything we're aware of in that area. We've just filtered to that. So we may have kicked some things out that that aren't there very often, but we kind of retain that, so we can go back to that if more information comes in the future, thinking especially kind of insect populations and species where maybe we don't have particularly great data on them at the moment. So results. So I'm going to talk through that kind of weighting exercise for the conservation concern, and then our community engagement side. Ecosystem services haven't got, and we've got a nice, neat little analysis with kind of pollination dependency for one of our local growers, but because that's kind of all focused on pollinators, I've left that out for the moment. So go in with our top 5, and these are all sort of scaled 0 to 1 in terms of importance. Number 5, poor beagle, which, if we manage to get any kind of concrete data on that at some point, that would be incredible. But I think that's a bit of a challenge everywhere. Bottlenose dolphins, puffins come out. European oyster as well, which I was sort of pleased to get that. You sort of think maybe that's a good indication we've done quite a good job of balancing the fact that everyone records birds. So that comes out and really important for our kind of seagrass habitats. And then there's at least one man in the room that will probably be happy to see that on top. So that's the conservation concern. Those circles are proportionate to that that size, that weighting. The other one, Tara mentioned the kind of global population. The only thing that triggers that criteria for us is the northern gannet. If you're interested, from the actual other weighting, it comes out way down in sort of 370th ranked species. From the community side, we get quite a different picture in that we get things that are recognizable and people spend a lot of time with them and get to see easily. So things like butterflies come out, moths came out quite well, but mostly we had quite a lot of seabirds come out here. So things like your puffin and your gannet, big players and much bigger players relative to everything else. Now, if you then kind of combine that and you do a bit of an equal weight combination, you get something that looks like that. So that is ignoring that gannet population thing. So puffins, everyone loves puffins, they come to the top. One of the interesting things when you do that, though, is you don't just end up with a whole list of seabirds. You get things like our little moss carder bee, which is 29th ranked from our conservation, but it actually scores quite highly in both. It's just the scaling does its job, and that comes out in the 6th. So that's quite interesting that we're picking up on things like that, and that you wouldn't necessarily have as high up if you didn't have that mix of looking at conservation, but also what's important to people. So we've got that list now. Great. What do we do with it? Well, look at how the populations are changing, and ideally look at a kind of modeling based approach to favorable reference values. If you haven't come across them, if you kind of think of like a minimum population viability, and then what you want to do is you want to whack a little bit on top to kind of make it favorable. How much that little bit is, it's kind of down to the individual churchgoer, but it's sort of 10% is the church of preference, it seems, for not necessarily the best reasons always. So we get our trends, we then look at making those available. Tara talked about that. That'll be through our record centre. If you're interested in what we're doing with the record centre and our Pan Channel Islands Record Centre collaboration, there's a poster down at the front. Please go have a look. And I think John and Julia are in the room somewhere, so you're welcome to come and talk to any of us as well. And then lastly, kind of, I want to talk about the other side of that. So it's what's important and what's important to members of the community, how they're changing, making that available so you can access it, you can see it. But then there's a gap there, right, where you're going, I'm interested in this and I'm concerned about it, but what can I actually do? And that's something that we're interested in as a wildlife trust, and getting more people into biological recording and more people into citizen science. It's also something where the results of our kind of community engagement are quite interesting. So to talk you through that plot, that's just for Atlantic puffin, and those are the different categories that people put things into. So you've got important for livelihood and well-being, concerned about decline, enjoy citizen science involving it, any other positive reason, and we've also got this kind of because the species has a negative impact. So that was kind of geared up towards our invasive species.
1 minute.
Thank you. So if you look at those, we've got a range of different patterns here. Things like gannets and puffins score quite well in everything apart from because they're harmful. Great, people care about them. Bass, people really concerned about declines, not that much otherwise. Sour fig, rewardingly, people find it harmful. One person quite likes it, otherwise it doesn't come out. But really what I want to focus on is the fact that of those species, the only ones we kind of really do citizen science effort with are are privet hawk moth, and there's a little bit with the puffin as well, and they really peak around that citizen science. And so if we do have that option available, it's a means of getting people involved with that recording and hopefully building that kind of sense of empowerment, and you can do something that's helpful. And that's one of the things we're doing as well with kind of taster sessions and a bit more in-depth training. So we're going to publish this year. If you have any data that you think you haven't asked me, I'd like to contribute, please let us know. Big thanks to Mel, everyone who's talked to us, sent us lists, anything interested in the project. Very grateful to all of you and our funders. Thank you.